We're on the coast. The ocean was right there, beautiful green belt. But you didn't have to travel too far to see how dry it was and how hard it would have been to grow crops. That's there where I met Dan and Carrie Weens and their kids, Abigail and Jeremy, and had a great relationship right off the bat. They were working for another agency at the time, but during that time, Dan and Carrie began to understand the importance of agriculture and what it might mean to Africa. And so each time that I went, I just renewed that friendship, and this morning to see Dan and Carrie and Abby here is really great. And I even forgive Dan for leaving me stranded on the road one day. I want you to know that I think it was the first time we were there. I went with President Phil at the time, and Phil jumped in the front, and I opened the back door and threw my stuff in and said, I'm just going to get on the other side. Closed the door, and the truck was gone. And there I stood, and for the longest time, it wasn't like just, oops, they went up and around, and finally Phil said, isn't that right, Lou? Apparently that's what he said. And there was no answer from the back. And they came back and found me. That was so kind of them. But anyway, it really is a privilege to have Dan and Carrie here because they are passionate, they are articulate, they know what God has laid on their hearts. They have a vision, not just for South Africa, but for many parts of Africa. You heard Tim Jacobson mention that Dan was in Ethiopia working with the Kelahewit Church there. He's been in Tanzania working with some of the connections that I've had in Tanzania over the years. And Farming God's Way has really become the heartbeat of who they are as a missionary couple. And so I invite Dan and Carrie to come and share with us this morning.
Well, good morning. Good morning, everyone. And it is a real privilege and a joy to be with you this morning. I actually feel very much at home, having lived 8 years just down the road in Markham. And so being here is a special privilege. So my name is, as Lou said, my name is Dan. This is my wife, Carrie, and we have two adult now children. Jeremy is going into his third year university in Kelowna, and Abigail has been with us and is with us this morning. There's our daughter Abigail. She's 18 and starting university in September. And so when we head back home to South Africa, we will be, for the first time, empty nesters, having both our kids studying in Canada. But one of the number of reasons why it's great to be with you is that your reputation for engagement and involvement in international mission, being on God's mission around the world, precedes you. And so we feel like we're among like-minded people today, just really passionate about what God's doing around the world and being involved in that.
So good morning. I'd like to start with a little bit of a interactive exercise. So, I've got to get this working now. I'm going to put some pictures up on the screen for you, and my question is, where do you think this is? So if you look at this picture, where do you think that this is? And I'm looking specifically for a country.
You're probably not used to calling things out in the middle of a sermon time. This isn't a sermon, so you can just relax and call things out. Where do you think this is? Zambia.
You're right. That's good. Good job.
That was impressive.
Yeah, that's very...
Who was that? That was...
Yeah, so this is Zambia, taken September 2013. So at this point, there hadn't been rain in the country for about 7 months. The last rain had been in February, and there is usually a dry season at that time of year, but this one had been particularly long. So I just want you to look at the picture, because we're going to compare some pictures. When you see this picture, how does it make you feel? Yell it? Yeah, okay, so now, to give you an idea, on this day, the temperature was 45 degrees. It was super, super, super hot.
When the wind came up, it felt like a hot air dryer blowing in your face. It was something.
There's a bit of a delay on this.
Just hold it up. This might be. There you go.
Okay, where do you think this is? Also Zambia.
Nice.
Excellent. At exactly the same time of year. When you look at, how do you compare this picture to the first one? What do you see? Yeah, so there's much more abundance in this picture, and this is a farm in God's Way garden. I love it because it's at exactly the same time of year, in the exact same type of soil. Where do you think this is?
Not Zambia.
North Africa.
Okay, North Africa, excellent. Sudan. Okay, this is April 2010. What do you notice about this picture? Very dusty. So there's a sandstorm, a windstorm. How does this make you feel? Yeah.
Lost.
You wouldn't, those sandstorms are terrible. Okay, where do you think this is? This is in the USA. This was in the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. It was a catastrophic event happening after intensive plowing in the US. It moved
And Canada.
And Canada. It moved a whole bunch of soil. Where do you think this is? Say it again? It's also the US. That exact same Dust Bowl. Massive, massive windstorms.
Drifts of soil moving across the prairies.
Okay, where do you think this is? Say again? Okay, no?
Canada.
Okay, good guess. Looks like Canada, fields look like Canada. This is South Africa. January 2016. Okay, now this is one of 3 major windstorms that moved a huge amount of soil. And I want to ask you, how do you feel when you see this? Say it louder. Powerless. Okay.
Powerless, yeah.
Dan, how do you feel?
Yeah, very, very sad, and I mean, this is a desperate picture, right? Just imagining the devastation in the farm fields.
This is soil.
Yeah,
Okay.
topsoil.
Topsoil.
Not just any soil. This is topsoil off the fields. Yeah.
Where do you think
Looks
this
like
is?
a tsunami, yeah.
Okay, that's a good guess. This is Malawi. Okay, on one side you have the Malawi maize, which is like field corn, and on the other side you have Malawi cotton. How does this make you feel? Okay.
Wonderful, hopeful. Yeah.
How does this compare to some of the other pictures that you've seen? It's quite a difference, hey?
These are also farming God's Way plots.
Okay, where is this and who is this? That is Lou and Phil, and this is their visit to South Africa. And you can't see it very well on this screen, but there is a garden behind them, and it's not one of our best gardens. It's a garden that's really struggling. And this is just an indication of some of the challenges that we have when we're working with people. Okay, we tend to associate Africa with this: hunger, famine, disease. And we don't often associate Africa with a picture like this. So this is also in South Africa. Can you see a tiny little bald head?
Nice, thanks.
This is one of our demonstration fields. This is taken December 2014.
Nice healthy field of maize there. Yeah.
So even more, we're not used to hearing good news stories from Africa. Where do you think this is? Okay, this is Malawi. And this is a good news story from Malawi. The 2018 harvest from Charles Matoa's farm was 45 bags. Look at all those bags full of maize. That equals about 2.25 tons of maize, or 2,250 kilograms of maize on his hectare of land. Now, if you've got a pen, I want you to write that down. Try and remember that number, because we're going to compare it a little bit later. I'm going to ask you for it. So it's either 2.25 tons for that hectare, or 2,250 kilograms for that hectare. How do you feel when you see Charles's face? I don't know if you can you see it very well? Okay, he looks pretty excited. This is an incredible harvest that he's gotten off his land. Oh, there's the number right there. So keep that in mind. As Christians, we consider ourselves to be gospel bearers. We are carriers of the good news. So we get excited of stories like the woman at the well, when Jesus comes to her and he right away can tell that there's a thirst deep inside her soul. He knows things about her that nobody else knows, and he truly knows us. And then, after he did the amazing miracle of feeding the 5,000, he gets away for a bit with some of those people, and he says to them, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." We get pumped because the teachings of Jesus speak to something deep within us. And as it talks about in the Bible, he had an authority, and he spoke with an authority that few leaders had ever spoken of before. But my question for you this morning is, who is this promise for? When Jesus says very specifically to this group of people, "Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty," who do you think that promise is for? Is this promise for this man up on the screen, an Ethiopian food vendor? Do you know in Ethiopia they say that 5 million people or more are food insecure? And in South Africa, we've had studies, household surveys taken, where we found that 1 in 2 families in South Africa have some kind of food insecurity. Now, when they talk about food security, what they're talking about is a family's access, physical access and economic access to food. And in some ways, if a family is not able to access food on a daily basis and in an amount that is sufficient for the family, then that is considered to be food insecurity. So when you look at this gentleman in Ethiopia, he's got a basket of food on his head. Is this promise for him? Could he stand in front of Jesus and Jesus say to him, "If you come to me, you will never be hungry and you will never be thirsty"? And then, is this promise for this woman in South Africa? This lovely lady, her name is Tolakele, and she is supporting 14 people. Luz actually visited her homestead. She's supporting 14 people in her household. If she comes to Jesus, will she never hunger and thirst again? And which hunger and thirst are we referring to in this statement? How encompassing is this promise of Jesus? You see, our hunger and thirst exists in many different areas of life. There's a physical hunger, which we feel in our stomach, in our throat. It's for food, for water, but there's also a hunger for safety and protection of our physical being. Then there is a social hunger and thirst for relationships, for love, for justice, for law and order. And then there's a mental and emotional hunger and thirst. And that is for things like empowerment and dignity. People hunger and thirst for those kind of things. And you know, in the world there's a lot of disempowerment. And finally, there is the spiritual hunger and thirst for identity, for purpose, for redemption, and for hope. As gospel bearers, we need to have good news in all of these areas. got a bit of a delay on this. And what is amazing is that Jesus is certainly big enough and great enough to be the answer in all four of these areas. When he says, you will never be hungry and you will never be thirsty, we honestly feel like he is saying that it's in your whole life, that there is not one hunger or one thirst that he cannot meet. Now think about that.
Yeah, one of the ideas that we want to challenge this morning is that a verse like this relates only to the physical. What if the good news, only relates to the spiritual, sorry. Yeah. What if the good news that we have is much bigger than just the spiritual or the afterlife, which we tend to focus on?
And what we've come to see living in South Africa is that Jesus actually represents a whole gospel. That there is a whole message of good news that we as the church need to think about and need to have an answer for. It's for every sphere of life. So this is the African reality that we are experiencing right now. Africa consists of 20% of the world's landmass, and yet it only produces 3 to 4% of the GDP of the world. Is that good news? Is that good news?
Is that the kingdom come to Africa yet?
If they have 20% of the landmass, and Africa is not limited in its resources, it has lots of resources, and yet it's only producing 3 to 4% of the GDP of the world. That's not actually good news. Can we actually say to Africans that they will never or hunger or thirst again with these kind of figures?
So why does Africa appear poor? And I use those words carefully. Africa looks poor to us. Why is that? There are many factors, and those factors are in all four spheres of life, but let's just take one example. And the example we'll use this morning is agronomics. So it's physical on the land, and it's the problem of erosion. This picture was taken in Ethiopia last year. That's me. And what I want you to understand is this used to be a farm field. And the soil level, it was fairly flat, and the field level was up at the top where you see the black soil. Can you see those 3 or 4 points with black soil on it? That was the level of the farm field. Okay? How much soil erosion has happened on this field? There's a red line there. Can you see it? Now I can reach more than about 7 feet, and so how many feet or meters of erosion has happened on that land? Why has that happened? I want you to know this area will never support, well, I don't want to say never because we serve a great God, but this field today is unsuitable for farming, and you can see why. There's no soil left.
So I want to give you an idea of what this type of erosion looks like in our context. So this is a picture of a rugby field, and it is approximately a hectare of land, a rugby field. You can also do a regular baseball field. That would also considered to be a hectare of land. Now, in Africa today, we lose 50 to 250 tons of soil per hectare per year. Okay?
Minimum 50 tons.
Okay, that is like 13 dump trucks of soil. So 13 dump trucks moving onto this field and removing, here they go, 1 load each of soil every year. Okay, now you ask me what that field is going to look like after those 13 dump trucks every year, after only even 5 years, what your field is going to look like, and after 10 years, let alone 50 years for the next generation of children that are going to play on that sports field. They say in Zimbabwe that the annual erosion of soil is like a goods train that wraps the world 2 times
full of soil.
Full of soil.
So they say often that our survival as a species depends on the 2 feet under our feet. How do we survive without the ability to produce crops? So have a look at this picture. This picture was also taken...
Sorry.
That's okay.
It's difficult to...
So this picture was taken very close to a prior Canadian food grains project that Lou took me to, my first time to Ethiopia. There was a river running nearby. Can you see how that river is running full of soil? This picture broke me. I want to tell you, this broke me because our children's inheritance is washing down the rivers into the ocean. It's our inheritance is washing away. The highest erosion rates in the world are in Ethiopia. Everybody farms, but the country struggles to feed itself, and this is a big reason why. This soil erosion after a rain event is a direct result of conventional farming practices. So what are those conventional practices that are practiced? Everywhere I've traveled in Africa, this is what they're doing. So first of all, heavy and repeated plowing of the soil. In Ethiopia, they plow their fields 4 times before planting. And each time they plow, it's after a rain event, so they're wasting the first 4 rains, and then they plant their seed. Okay? The problem with this plowing is it destroys the soil structure and releases or breaks down the ability of the soil to hold moisture and nutrients. Okay? So, secondly, slash and burn practices. Everywhere I've gone, they want to see, the African people want to see their soil bare. They don't want to see anything on the surface of the soil. Again, after plowing and then leaving it bare, leaving that soil perfectly ready for heavy erosion during a rain. Thirdly, we see monocropping, planting the same thing in the same place year after year after year. And if you know about agriculture, if you plant in your gardens, hopefully you know that planting the same thing in the same place guarantees that you're going to have pest and disease. And then fourthly, the attitude that we can just take nutrients from the soil without putting anything back, lack of soil amendment, okay? So that's the conventional practice we're seeing, and as a result of these conventional practices, we're seeing decreasing yields year on year, often total crop failure, and land degradation. You can see from this graph the heavy yield reductions year after year. First year in a new area, yields are okay. Second year, this graph shows about half. Sometimes it's even worse. And to the point where by the 5th or 6th year, you can't grow anything on that soil anymore.
Okay, so what we want to do now is give you an idea of actual numbers. So we saw that graph going down, and so most of the farmers now in Africa are farming at that lowest level of yield. And when they've done studies, they've come up with a number on average of what these farmers are producing. So the first number I want to give you is what an average family of 6 would need to survive on, a calorie equivalent, and that is 1,250 kilograms of maize per year. Okay, that's just to fill the stomach. That doesn't include extras like meat or vegetables. Now, that average that I was talking about, at the very lowest of that graph, where after they've depleted the soil, they get to the point of this is where what they're producing every year. The average throughout Africa is only 350 kilograms per hectare. Now, a lot of farmers have a hectare of land, and some have a bit more, but there's many farmers that don't even have a full hectare of land. Can you see the shortfall? Okay, if a family needs 1,250 kilograms calorie-wise, and yet they're producing on their hectare of land 350, can you see that there's a shortfall there? They're not actually producing enough to feed their family. So they're having to buy food. So the amazing good news in all of this is if they switch to better farming methods, they see automatically in the first year an increase to 7,000 kilograms of maize on that same field. Okay,
with using what they have already and with less work.
That's not using chemical fertilizer, that's not purchasing any extra fancy stuff. It's using what they have in the land, at the land that they have right there.
Yeah, no plowing. Yeah, when I was in Ethiopia, I asked a colleague of ours who works there, his name's Ephraim. I said, Ephraim, a farmer who's doing really, really well, who's well respected and people think he's doing great, what is his annual yield? And we did the numbers, did the conversions, and it was about 0.5 ton a hectare. And that was somebody who was doing really, really well. And that's not doing really well.
Yeah, so did anybody go back to the Malawi farm? Do you remember what the number was that he was getting off his field? Okay, so that's right, 2,250. So is that more than a family of 6 would need to live for a year? Okay, it's double. And the interesting thing is the input that he is using in Malawi is only manure. So he's using manure from his cows. His next step would be to use compost, which would dramatically increase his yield to that 7,000 kilograms. So he's already doing amazingly well, like 2,250 compared to the 350 average is way and above the average of what the farmers around him are getting. Can you see how this is such visible and tangible example of good news?
Yeah, 2,000% increase in the first year of turning to farming God's way. That is really good news. So it's really easy for us to see this morning that agricultural reform, faith-based, turning to God's ways, to God as the master farmer, and learning to farm in harmony with creation is absolutely essential if we're going to see development happen on the nation of Africa, or on the continent of Africa. How can you build a society? How can you sustainably develop if you can't feed yourselves? Right? So what is farming God? What is farming God's way? We don't have time for that today. Because farming God's way encompasses and brings hope to all 4 of the spheres that we've been talking about this morning. But let's just look at the technology. What is different about farming God's way? So first of all, we want to see little soil disturbance, that God's forests, he doesn't plow. So we're going to mimic what we see in creation. So no plowing, only enough soil disturbance to put inputs, your organic fertilizer and seed into the soil. Secondly, we want to see the soil covered. Just like in God's forest, you see a thick layer of mulch cover on the ground. The trees are shedding and breaking down and adding fertility to the soil. That's what we're teaching our farmers to do. Leave your crop residues on the surface of the soil. Thirdly, in God's creation, we see a rich biodiversity of species. We're going to mimic that principle by practicing crop rotations, breaking the pest and disease cycle, conditioning the soil with different crops. And then fourthly, that spiritual principle of we have to give in order to receive. We're going to practice that on our soils. We're going to give back, not just be takers of fertility from the soil. We're going to give something back by putting soil amendment in the soil, usually, hopefully, ideally through homemade high-grade compost, which we teach them to make. So turning to these practices leads to increasing yields year after year because we're taking care of the soil, and the soil is growing in fertility, not declining in fertility. Unfortunately, there's no practice where fertility stays the same. You're either building the soil or depleting the soil. So we've seen that conventional agriculture practices lead to heavy depletion of the soil and destruction of the land, directly resulting in poverty for the rural poor. Obviously, this was never God's intent. God is a God of provision and abundance. Jesus said, I've come that they might have life and have it abundantly. You'll recall that when God planted a garden in the east of Eden, God put Adam in the garden and said, I want you to look after and take care of the garden. It was in this passage, it's, I want you to look after the soil. And the idea is that Adam would be blessed with the abundance of the garden as Adam looks after it. I believe this instruction to Adam still stands for us today. That instruction to mankind has never been taken away. We have the responsibility to look after his creation. Part of the coming of God's kingdom through Jesus Christ is reversing the curse of the fall in all areas, including agronomically, and reclaiming God's rule and reign over all of creation once again. And we have come to see that restoration of the land and replenishment of the soil is essential to seeing the yoke of poverty broken in Africa. I often teach in my trainings, stop worrying about the plants. Look after the soil. Be farmers of the soil. The soil looks after the plants, and the plants look after us. That's how God made it from the beginning. Now, contrary to what many people think, Africa is incredibly rich in all kinds of resources. Natural resources, physical resources, human, social, economic, and spiritual resources. Africa is a rich continent, but we're not realizing the abundance. Okay? We tend to think of Africa as a needy continent, and that the solution, therefore, because they're needy resource-wise, the solution must be to give resources. And this is what the West has done since World War II, is ship off huge shiploads of grain to Africa because they're poor, they're hungry, they're needy, and we must give them so that they can survive. We don't believe that that is the solution that God intends. So what is the solution? The solution is that Africans would see what God has already placed in their hands, and that they would learn to steward those resources, and as a result, create wealth. God said, I've given you everything you need to create wealth, so that they learn to use what God's put in their hand in the wisest way possible. We want to see that Africa and Africans would steward its abundance, and that as a result there would be an unleashing of abundance, a tidal wave of abundance, of restorative overflow to and from the continent. So this is now our vision statement that we've been working on recently. Just imagine Africa as a net giver rather than begging. Wouldn't that be great? And our prayer is that would happen in our lifetime.
And so we've actually been amazed at what God has done over the last 8 years of us being in South Africa. So that's us. We started in a small geographical area in South Africa, and we've gradually widened our influence to Ethiopia and Tanzania. And we're just really excited about the possibility of generating a momentum for unleashing the whole gospel message in Africa. God has divinely connected us through EMCC partnerships. We've been connected with over 20 partners in South Africa, connected to the Kali Hayward Church in Ethiopia, and connected to an NGO in Tanzania called MIBOS. It really is exciting to see what he is doing. And in all of it, it's like people are waking up with a thirst for a different way of alleviating poverty, one that builds capacity and does not create dependence. Your church has actually been instrumental in nurturing a new initiative of training Ethiopian Bible school teachers in the tool of farming God's way, and that's very exciting.
In fact, just this last week, the Trainer's Reference Guide for Farming God's Way, there's an English copy at the back, but the translation into Amharic, the first draft has been completed just this last week, yeah. So all of these exciting developments have helped us to clarify our mission as a family as we move forward in Africa. And we would articulate our mission. It's here on the screen. Our mission is to build capacity in people who become leaders in the wise utilization of local resources, facilitating a holistic transformation, moving from languishing to flourishing. And this languishing to flourishing, that's what we see. We don't see middle ground. People are either developing and flourishing and living in abundance, or they're living in hopelessness and despair. And more times than not, it's the latter. But God has a plan. Okay. Now, we can talk about abundance. This is to Africans now, as we teach and train. We can talk about abundance and intensive planting and year-round vegetable production and 10 tons of maize a hectare. But what we're finding is that the people that we're teaching can't even begin to imagine what we're talking about because they've never seen it. So we have been able to, as best as we can, to demonstrate to a few people in a fairly remote area the power of farming God's way. You saw a picture of our demonstration field earlier. This is land that has been on loan from the local chief. It's inaccessible. There's other issues with it. But we have what we want to see is a permanent, accessible training base and demonstration farm established in South Africa. One that is highly accessible, one that's close to the airports where leaders can come from all over Africa and beyond to come and learn the principles of farming God's way in a deep, deep way. The model farm will serve to inspire and train leaders from all over the world how to build soil fertility at no financial cost. That's important. Using resources that are already available. The only cost being time. And most Africans have time. They say we have watches, but they've got the time. So the model farm will be an environment for experiential learning so that leaders can see their next steps in transforming their communities and to see the necessity of implementing not just half, but implementing at a high standard. Whatever you do, do it as unto the Lord. And as you do things wholeheartedly and do things well, the abundance comes back. Just imagine leaders walking through the experiential gardens of a model farm, experiencing for the first time God's abundance, much like Adam experienced walking with God through the garden in the cool of the day. So at the moment, we've been in transition, and right now we're in the process of setting up an NGO that'll be registered in South Africa, which will partner with EMCC in the development of this model farm, and for the purpose of developing leaders, African leaders. So as we near our conclusion, I just want to say that it's really easy for us to see African problems as overwhelming and unsolvable. Would you agree? You think of Africa and it's just like, when is it ever going to change? It feels like there's nothing we can do. Issues like hunger, famine, disease, those issues seem far too big and far too remote for us here in North America. What can we do? What is the answer? The answer isn't handouts. The answer is to build capacity in Africans so that they can provide for themselves as God had intended from Adam up until now. And the good news for us as we look at the problems is that we're seeing what we believe to be an unprecedented movement of people and leaders in Africa who are taking courageous steps to see communities begin to understand these principles, direction of hope and health and wholeness for themselves, their families, and their communities. We are the bearers of good news for the poor. The good news is that God has already given all of us, poor, rich, He's given us what we need to provide for ourselves in life and to develop in a sustainable way. And I love, this is a key passage for me. You remember Jesus in the synagogue, at the very beginning of His ministry, He went into the synagogue, He was invited to read from the scroll of Isaiah, and He knew where He was, and He turned to the passage, quoting from Isaiah, saying, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, to preach good news to the poor." And you know the rest of the verse. Recovery of sight for the blind, freedom for the oppressed, and the year of the Lord's favor. And then He sat down, all eyes were on Him, and what did Jesus say? "Today, this prophecy has been fulfilled in your hearing." It's amazing. The prophecy is fulfilled. In Jesus Christ is the good news. There's a here and a now implication to these words, going back 2,000 years ago, right up until today. Now, in our lifetime, we have good news of a kingdom that's come and is continuing to come. And we partner with God in the ushering in of His kingdom. This isn't about believe in Jesus so that you can be in heaven with Him in the afterlife. As important as that is, the good news is bigger than that, and it has a right now component. Okay. the good news isn't just a spiritual good news, that you'll never hunger and thirst again spiritually. It's a holistic good news for the physical, the emotional, the mental, the social, and the spiritual aspects of our lives and our communities. In South Africa, we've sat in church services knowing that half or so of the congregation are food insecure, many of them having no food in the pantry. In North America, who do we sit next to in church? And what is their holistic situation? Maybe they're not hungry, but maybe they need the touch of Jesus in an area of their life, for sure spiritual, but what other areas of their life as we think about the whole person? Each one of us has the opportunity to use our gifts in our unique contexts and our relationships and sphere of influences to be good news and agents of transformation in our world. Whether it's here, whether it's in Africa, this is what we're called to. For us, we're using a God-given tool called Farming God's Way. It's a resource that brings hope and healing. It brings God's truth to all 4 areas of life for the rural poor in Africa. We found that it's just a tool that works really well for us, and Farming God's Way is not just about growing food. Through Farming God's Way, we're seeing God set people free spiritually, to bring hope for the hopeless, people together for socially for encouragement and support, of course to put food on the table with overflowing produce and grain for sale in their communities. But for us, bringing good news to the poor is an exciting and it's a hope-filled journey. It's not something where, wow, this is desperate, but we'll do the little bit that we can. No, we partner with God in His coming kingdom. God is on a mission. I love the I don't know if you'd call it a slogan, but where Pastor Phil, our previous president, I believe, helped us as a denomination just put a stake in the ground and say, his mission, God's mission, that's our mission. And that's our privilege. We want to say that it's an exciting journey that we're on, being on God's mission as a family, but we're not doing it alone. We've got a team behind us, and you are part of that team. And I wish we could just take what's in our hearts and give it to you, just in terms of our gratitude for the invitation to be here, for your support, your prayer support, your partnership with us in bringing good news to rural Africa. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Don't run away. I am on, right? Yes, there we go. Dan, I remember one of your statements that has stuck with me like glue when you said, farming God's way will break the yoke of poverty in Africa. And I hear that in your hearts, and I trust that that will be what we will see in your lifetime. Maybe not mine. I'm a little older than you. But I'm trusting that that's what we'll see. And ask that you would together pray with us for Dan and Carrie and their 2 lovely children that are now going to be walking away from Mom and Dad. Abby, good to have you with us. And that God would just continue to bless them. Their ministry is not just agriculture. I hope you caught that. It's at the heartbeat of what they do because it's an answer to a huge problem in Africa. But it's discipleship, it's mentoring, it's all of those things. And I'm trusting that we'll be able to stand with them. You stand with me and we'll pray for Dan and Carrie and their family. Father God, we thank you for your servants who you call from far and wide, and who you equip amazingly to do the tasks that you have set before them. So we pray for Dan and Carrie. We thank you, Father, for their commitment, for their love, for their passion. And ask, Lord, that you would just richly bless them, that they might see the dream and the fulfillment of their vision come true. Father, would you bless the people of Africa? Would you rain upon them a season of goodness and grace and mercy, that one day they would be indeed flourishing as an entire community, as an entire continent. And so, Father, we send this couple off and their family with our blessing and with your blessing, and might we hear great reports in the days ahead. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.